So I'm Benjamin. I'm presenting also today for my colleague Tom. We're researchers at the University of Klagenfurt and also representatives of our local game lab. And today I will talk a bit about our research, which deals with the phenomenon of morality in player game interaction, or to be more precise, we work with an approach that regards morality as a game design element. If well done in the spirit of today's program, enchants or even disenchants players. So how are we going to tackle this here today? First things first, we'll have to talk a bit about the field in which our research is located, namely the field of video game ethics. Further, we will look at morality itself as a concept. Based on that, I'll introduce you to my notion of moral complexity, which is a form of moral content visible in most contemporary video games. And I'll present you then how moral complexity functions, and we will even have like a short interactive section where you might even be able to apply and detect it in games that I will present to you. Finally, I'll also present you our experiment, which is part of Tom's and my current research project, and a conclusion will follow, hopefully opening up a critical discussion. So, what the heck is video game ethics? Video game ethics is a subfield of game studies that has emerged in the early 2000s, mostly as a response on the debates on violent video games. The idea was to regard, as Sagal said, the moral worth in video games by thinking games through ethics, but also moral psychology. Out of that, three research angles have crystallized. One regards morality as game design element, so how the aspect of morality is implemented in games. The other angle deals with how these moral phenomena in games are experienced by players, also like the impact of moral encounters. And the most recent approach is to look at how games are produced. So this does look at the production of games and working conditions in the industry and how these infringe ethical standards. All of these approaches are fairly fascinating, but we deal here primarily with the former, so morality as a game design element, but logically we also operate with the second field, so morality as player experience. To give you an example, we decided today to present you the game Frostpunk as an ideal case, not just because it is winter and the second part of the game is going to be released soon, but also because it exhibits a very interesting use of morality to engage players. So in the game Frostpunk, we need to survive as a society and city in a freezing cold dystopian future where, we didn't reach our climate goals, but there it got colder, not hotter. And in order to advance our city and stabilize our society, we have to make difficult choices. Moral choices, for example, enforcing child labor or not, removing political adversaries or letting them build up a position. Our opposition. Our decisions have a direct impact on the discontent and hope of our society. With almost every major decision we make, we face dilemmas that are, in addition from a narrative perspective, extremely well presented in the game. On top of that, you can see on the left picture, the game operationalizes morality with its parameters of hope and discontent as a form of direct feedback of moral action. This game manages to enchant its players by making moral choices manageable, by granting us direct feedback to our decisions, but also limiting the choices that we have in these dilemmas. On the other hand, it also disenchants and even paralyzes players by the difficulty of some dilemmas and the rhetorical magic of its narrative that urges us constantly to reflect on our choices. So, but how does the system work in deploying morality as an engaging but also challenging experience for the player? And we argue by making use of moral complexity. Before speaking of moral complexity, we need to clarify what we mean with speaking of morality, right? So, because often we use morality and ethics, but often we don't really draw the distinction. And in my theory of moral complexity, I ground my understanding of morality in Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. I created this model here to illustrate what I mean and highlight the difference between having the feeling of experiencing morality in a video game opposed to actually facing them in the real world with real consequences. And according to Kant, morality itself is the condition under which alone a rational being can be an end in itself. What does that mean? That means without morality, we would not be able to consider a thing as good in itself. There would be, for example, the act of help, right? Most of us would consider the act of helping someone a good in itself. Henceforth, all have an understanding of morality. But here comes the tricky part. Morality is, as a domain, as Kant says, unintelligible. That means morality is metaphysical and ontologically unapproachable. However, morality appears to us in manifestations that we regard as moral phenomena. These phenomena do usually surface to us as encounters that we interpret as morally charged. These encounters provoke us to make judgments and decisions of which we, and now it gets tricky again, cannot know if they are morally right and wrong. Hence, we consult ethics, which are constructed systems of principles for orientation. In video games, so like in Frostpunk, moral encounters are simplified and engineered as a simulation of what it would mean to encounter a dilemma. And this simplification or rendering of moral encounters into a ludified moral space is crucial because that is what makes morality playable and enjoyable in the first place. Because simplifying moral phenomena into moral complexity makes it manageable, like in Frostpunk. And we can anticipate the outcomes here by the feedback we receive, and we have like these limited choices, which makes it manageable, a manageable challenge, and that should be ringing a bell. Yes, the one and only Csikszentmihalyi and his notion of flow. At this point, my greatest respect to the scholar himself, who has just recently passed away. But just to have everyone on the same page, the idea of flow is, as most of you know, an essential notion applied in game design and game studies since over the last 20 years. Flow describes an optimal state where players are challenged by game design, but perceive in-game activities as manageable. So flow equals the right amount of challenge a player can handle. Okay, so if moral complexity is a form of rendered moral content, how does it operate in engaging players besides just being simplified? And we say by the degree of which it offers alternatives and or commentary to violence and deceit. Games rely heavily on meta-communications in order to be understood by a vast audience of players with different backgrounds. And games operate hence with universal notions. And that is why you think of it, if you think about the moral encounters in games, mostly you think or experience them being grounded by an exposition to violence and deceit. And whether moral complexity is high or low in the game depends on how frequently you are granted alternatives to violent and deceitful actions and or commentary which critically frames these aspects. Alternatives to violence and deceit constitute a set of diverse options to engage with a situation in a game. If violence and deceit are morally wrong, we ought to find ways to solve situations peacefully and honest. So if a game allows us to progress in a game by solving conflicts without violence and deceit, we can speak of a higher degree of moral complexity. If game design declares violence and deceit mandatory to progress, we face a lower degree of moral complexity. However, even games that do not allow alternatives to violence and deceit can contain a considerable degree of moral complexity. Moral complexity can be communicated through commentary, which is the critical framing of morally wrong actions. A suitable idea of commentary is what Ian Bogost means by regarding games as capable of making arguments about the systems they represent. So commentary can be, however, also more direct and presented by dialogues between characters in games or reflective monologues of the playable character. In that sense, we can regard moral complexity as a scale. A game possesses low moral complexity when players are offered little or no alternatives to violence and no commentary. A game possesses medium moral complexity if players are offered recurring alternatives to violence and deceit or commentary. And the game possesses high moral complexity if players are always offered, or most of the time, alternatives to violence and deceit, in addition to commentary. So here comes the interactive part to wake you a bit up. I'll present you 4 games, and you can think about if it is low, medium, or high moral complexity. What would be great if you also would share your assessment in the chat, and I will give you 5 seconds to decide. I chose games that should be mostly known, so even if you haven't played it, have a guess. So, first game is Grand Theft Auto 5. The second game is Tetris. The third game is Civilization 6. And the final game is Spec Ops: The Line. All right, so let's see if you were right, or well, right from our interpretation. So, Grand Theft Auto, let's start at the beginning. So Grand Theft Auto would be low moral complexity. Why is that? Because we have no choice to progress the game without enforcing violence. There is no way of playing that game in regards to the single player mode, so the story driven aspect of the game, without enforcing violence. Also, almost at no given times, the violence or deceitful actions are critically framed. One could argue that the cynical aspect gives a commentary, but that can be discussed. So here we face low moral complexity. With Tetris, and that refers now to an interesting aspect of the definition in itself. Here we face no moral complexity because we don't even have an exposition of violence and deceit. Hence, in regards of moral complexity, that falls flat. Civilization 6 has high moral complexity because it can be played completely non-violently and without any deceit, and we receive constantly commentary on our action by the political situation and relations we have with the other civilizations in the game. And Spec Ops: The Line, as some of you might know, is an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So even though it is a shooter and we go through it and we have to kill, it describes more or less the way into insanity and dehumanization by violence and killing. And at some points, we also have moral dilemmas where we can make decisions. All right. Yes. So we at the University of Klagenfurt, we love, of course, game studies and creating this theoretical construct. But the next step for us, as we also love engineering, is to set this theory into practice. And for that, I'll present you the Cure. That's a 2D prototype intended for a large-scale experiment planned for the next year, where we have made moral complexity a feature, so a scalable thing like difficulty, meaning this game can be played with high and low moral complexity, and I will show you both versions. The game is basically a mini game where you have to get medicine for your sick mother, and you have certain events in the game that are encounters. So I'll just play it through. So here we receive the task to get money from the chest to then go and buy the medicine. Here we have another part where we then face bandits, and we have only the choice to either bluff or fight, so deceitful or violent actions. So in the high moral complexity version, becomes a bit more complex. So even when we begin already, we have even the possibility to take more than we actually should. We receive also in that game directly commentary in form of a monologue reflection. So should we have taken more money than we should? And here we directly in this bandit section face more options that also have non-violent solutions, like just fleeing. All right, that being it. So what we did was to apply a version that is morally more challenging by higher moral complexity, and one that is almost devoid of moral conflict framed in the game by removing morality as a game design element. Please mind also that we're currently in a play testing stage and we're still working on the final version of this prototype for the experiment. I'll also post later a link to the game that is uploaded, so it would be great if you could if you have the time to play through it and give us some feedback to improve it. But yeah, I'll post that later. So now in order to actually see if people are enchanted or disenchanted by the game in our experiment, we made use of Georg Lind's concept of moral competence, which is the ability and skill to apply moral action. This is also something that can be empirically measured. So after our hypothesis, a game of lower moral complexity would be more enjoyed by a person with lower moral competence and the other way around. That's a bit trivial, but was never tested. Now, also, I'd like to say that we're not here to make any moral judgment. We're only trying from a game design perspective to show that moral engagement can only properly work if a person has appropriate moral competence to deal with it. To give you an example, imagine the game playing Fortnite or Call of Duty or another game that requires extreme reflexes and having extreme bad reflexes. That would be a very frustrating experience. So imagine a person being bombarded by moral challenge with no moral competence. So that would be also rather disenchanting in that case. This hypothesis will be tested in the next year by assessing moral competence scores of the testees, randomly assigning them one kind of the version, assessing then aspects of their experience, and correlate the data in the end. If you'd like to also participate in the future, let me know. We can connect, and I'll also inform on Twitter and via mail once the experiment is online. So let's summarize and conclude. So because we covered here actually quite some content in short time. So we talked about video game ethics and situated our work as being an approach that regards morality as game design element. We defined moral complexity as a form of moral content and being a simplified representation that allows to create challenges that are manageable in the perspective of flow. It essentially operates by the degree of offering alternatives and commentary. And we looked then at examples in games that already exist, and we also presented then the experiment. Now, this notion at this stage has many imperfections, such as that it is absolutely reductionist. It renders moral content in games and basically reduces them to violent and deceitful encounters. It also does not refer to aspects such as self-defense, and it also does not apply for contemporary ethical problems like, for example, environmentalism, as nowadays it is also regarded that we have a responsibility for our planet. So is that violence? Is that deceitful if we pollute our Earth? That is something to be discussed. However, nonetheless, we believe that moral complexity has a great potential to have an impact on the research of moral phenomena on video games through its quite easy application and discussion by even non-scholars that we have also seen. Also, moral complexity is scalable and provides more chances to diversify exposure to players, allowing games to reach greater and diversified audiences. I mean, imagine playing Grand Theft Auto in one version without violence. That would be very nice, I guess, also for the developers to reach a wider audience. But moral complexity could also become a new parameter for rating systems, allowing maybe games that are today regarded as PEGI 18 to become PEGI 16 because their violent content is critically framed by moral complexity. All in all, more theoretical and practical work, but also criticism and discussion has to be invested to make moral complexity relevant, but also sustainable. However, we're sure that in time and with further work on that, this notion will be able to reach further potential. And also, here's some reference. I also like to add that this research has been and is funded by the University of Klagenfurt and the Marshall Plan Foundation, just to be a bit transparent here. Also, please feel free to connect with me. There you got some links for social media and so on. So if you're interested in participating in the experiment, that would be great. Also, just receiving feedback. So thank you very much for this. I know that this was a bit heavy at this late hour. So thank you so much for bearing with